Even if you don't know much about El Salvador, you've probably seen this face.
Soy Nayib Bukele.
He's the president of this country and he's very popular. Nayib Bukele often brags on social media about what he's been able to accomplish, turning one of the most dangerous countries in Latin America into a place where you can now walk freely on the streets. He touts El Salvador as a beautiful tourism destination and as a country that's finally prospering. All because he was able to beat the gangs that used to control this country. But more than 4 years into his presidency, more and more people are starting to ask, is that the full story? Are the more than 70,000 people who have been arrested really dangerous gang members? And do those beautiful images on social media show what life is really like for most people in El Salvador?
Aquí estaba lleno de muchachos, de las pandillas y todo eso. Nadie podía entrar de otros lugares, así como ustedes que han venido, ¿verdad? Era bien difícil.
This is Distrito Italia. It was one of the strongholds of the Mara Salvatrucha 13 gang. Alba Lorena Soto Rodriguez says she always kept her doors and windows closed.
Yo les tengo miedo.
Even before moving here, she says gang members had threatened her.
No me querían matar, me dijeron, pero te doy 72 horas para que te vayas. Si te veo de pasar esas 72 horas, ya no vas a vivir para contar. Oh, chica.
¿Qué sentiste en ese momento?
Que el mundo es maravilloso. Porque dejé a mis 2 niños, no tenía para dónde irme. Ellos me amenazaron con armas.
At the time, she left the country, but after a few years, she came back to reunite with her family. Once in Distrito Italia, she says gang members set their eyes on one of her daughters.
Que le decían de que estaba bien bonita y yo les tenía miedo porque los veía todos tatuados. Y yo les digo, cuarto, usted es menor, le decía. Como yo veía las noticias que perdían las hipotas o que parecían muertos por otro lado. Entonces eso me daba miedo a mí.
She had reason to worry. Gangs routinely committed brutal violence against women.
Este lugar fue un lugar plagado de mara, de pandilleros.
Carlos lives in another municipality that was controlled by MS-13. He asked us to conceal his identity because he still fears for his safety. Carlos and his family are farmers. He says gang members used to extort them.
De lo poco que nos pagaban nosotros, entre nosotros como familia, como trabajando en las propiedades, reuníamos las 300 dólares que nos pedían y lo aportaban a los pandilleros. Un año que con los trabajos de nosotros no fue mal, nos atrasamos. Ahí se venían a poner a vigiarnos a nosotros, porque no habían nos aportado esa cantidad de dinero. Entonces que nos querían matar.
Through extortion, the gangs made millions of dollars every year. They forced business owners and workers to pay up or risk getting killed.
Me tuvieron hincado una vez. Me habían puesto un M6 en la cabeza, amenazándome que me fuera.
In 2015, El Salvador had one of the highest murder rates in the world.
To understand how gang violence got so bad in El Salvador, we have to talk about U.S. intervention here, because U.S. policy that spanned several decades and several presidents helped create the gangs that terrorized the Salvadorian people. First, we need to understand what was happening in the 60s and 70s. El Salvador was ruled by a handful of rich landowners, and that ruling class was exploiting workers, paying them starvation wages, keeping them in poverty. And people got tired of living like that, so they organized to demand better conditions. El Salvador's government responded with violence. Death squads were killing labor organizers, teachers, religious leaders, anyone who dared challenge the interests of the wealthy. And that's when the U.S. comes in, because the U.S. government was directly sending aid and supporting the government that was oppressing its own people. Why? Well, these were the Cold War years, and the U.S. did not want a communist takeover in its backyard. To prevent that, they would go on to support right-wing forces in this country, no matter what atrocities they committed. One of the most glaring examples of how U.S. intervention directly led to Salvadorian deaths was the massacre in El Mozote. Soldiers that had been armed and trained by the U.S. killed almost 1,000 innocent Salvadorians, half of them children. And that's the kind of violence that the people from El Salvador were fleeing when they migrated to the US. In LA, young Salvadorians were met with the violence of gangs that didn't accept them, so they created their own, La Mara Salvatrucha Stoners, which eventually became MS-13. In the 90s, when the gang violence and crime in LA became too much, the US deported convicted criminals back to their countries. Thousands of gang members were sent back to El Salvador, a country that had just been torn apart by civil war. In that environment, the gangs flourished and subjected the Salvadorian people to yet more decades of violence.
But in 2019, Nayib Bukele brought change. During his first year in office, homicides went down by almost 50%. And then in 2022, there was a setback. In March, the gangs killed 87 people in one weekend. And Bukele and his legislative assembly responded with an iron fist. They declared a state of exception. It gave police the power to detain anyone without a warrant, without having to tell them why, and people lost their right to an attorney.
Ese día nosotros para el centro íbamos. Ya habíamos agarrado a bastantes muchachos. Y a pesar de lo que a mí ya me habían hecho, ¿verdad? Me da lástima porque no les esperaba nada bueno.
Vamos a ir y vamos a atrapar a los delincuentes a donde quiera que estén, a donde quiera que se escondan.
In the first 2 months of the state of exception, police arrested more than 35,000 people. A year in, Bukele had managed to dismantle the gangs. Salvadorians could now go into neighborhoods where they hadn't dared step foot in years. Vendors could sell without getting extorted. And Alba now feels at peace in her community.
Nadie había hecho esto de poner mano dura sobre las pandillas. Nadie. De lo que yo tengo uso de razón, que se han sentado y se han ido y se han sentado gobierno, nadie.
In May, Bukele celebrated on Twitter that El Salvador had gone 365 days without homicides, a full year.
Tenemos más libertad, más seguridad.
Por primera vez empezamos a vivir y sentir la verdadera paz.
Bukele has been making sure the world knows what he has done. A former publicist, the president shares highly produced videos of tattooed men getting rounded up. The videos have been seen around the world, and they've gotten Bukele a lot of praise.
Nuestro presidente. Él está poniendo unas cosas tan bonitas. Él habla maravillas.
But the videos the president shares don't show people like Esmeralda Domínguez.
En ese documento dice que yo soy miembro activo de la Mara Salvatrucha.
She was arrested when one of her daughters was only 4 months old. By the time she was released, her baby was 1. And Esmeralda was given a document accusing her of being a gang member.
¿Y por qué si soy miembro activo estoy afuera? Si se supone que él dice en su gran publicidad que todos los que son, él los tiene hasta en un penal que es para ellos y que él no va a dejar salir a ninguno.
Esmeralda says the conditions in prison were inhumane.
Ahí hay piojos, ahí hay enfermedades, no hay higiene, no hay agua, 8 días sin bañarnos. Si habían enfermedades, aquí alguien estaba enfermo, nunca habían atenciones médicas a menos que ella estuviera prácticamente muriendo. O muerta, porque hubieron varias que ya las sacaban y ya no regresaban, murieron.
She says what's missing from Bukele's propaganda is how the state of exception has deepened poverty in communities like hers.
Por ejemplo, yo no puedo tener un trabajo formal porque me están pidiendo antecedentes penales.
Esmeralda is a farmer, and in the 8 months she was in prison, her crops got ruined. And her partner, whose income she counted on, was also arrested and is still detained.
¿Cómo va a hacer para sobrevivir? Dígame usted.
Sometimes Esmeralda has to skip buying her daughter's medicine because she doesn't have the money.
Le digo así, soy sincera, a veces no sé ni de dónde.
While Esmeralda was detained, it was her mother who took care of her daughters.
Es un atropello total que le han venido a hacer a las personas.
Esmeralda's mom is a survivor of the violence of the 80s, when the government was killing farmers who were fighting for their rights. Once again, she says, her family has become a victim of the state.
Simplemente vivir aquí en lugares pobres, seguimos siendo víctimas.
El Estado sabe, pues, quién, a dónde, pero lo más fácil es agarrar al inocente Eso es lo más fácil porque él sabe que nosotros no andamos huyendo.
Right before the state of exception, Bukele said there were 70,000 gang members in the streets of El Salvador. Since then, almost 74,000 people have been detained. But a report from the National Police of El Salvador leaked in September showed that almost 43,000 suspected gang members were still free. So if there are that many gang members still free, the question becomes, who has the state been arresting?
This is the Public Defender's Office of El Salvador. People come here every day trying to get news of their relatives that have been detained and that they haven't heard from in months. It's common to see a long line like this every single morning.
Mi hijo ya tiene 18 meses. 18 meses, lo agarraron el 22 de abril. Metieron el mismo policía y me dijo que no le llegó nada. Y prácticamente me lo llevaron por hacer números. Le faltaban 2 al policía.
The same month that her son was arrested, a police union in El Salvador said officers were being pressured to meet daily arrest quotas.
No tienen nada, le decía al otro, le decía un policía al otro. Viene y le dijo el otro, pero ni modo, nos faltan 2. Echarlos, le dijo, por hacer números. Por eso está mi hijo ahí.
El Salvador now has the highest incarceration rate in the world, and its president is the most popular leader in Latin America. That popularity has allowed him to amass a lot of power. Bukele now controls all 3 branches of government in El Salvador. That's how he's able to run for re-election, even though the Constitution forbids it. A president is not supposed to serve more than 1 consecutive term in El Salvador, but the legislature from Bukele's party replaced the judges on the Supreme Court. And then that court ruled that he could seek re-election. In response to criticism that he's dismantling democracy, Bukele calls himself the coolest dictator. Bukele has changed the laws to make himself more powerful, while Salvadorians lose the rights that used to protect them from the state. Remember Carlos, the young man who used to get extorted by the gangs? He says he went from being a victim of gang members to getting accused of being one of them. Carlos, his father and grandfather were on their way to work when they got arrested.
Yo iba adelante y alcancé a ver un soldado que iban cubriéndose en la vuelta. Ellos sin mediar palabras, sin preguntar nombres ni nada, le dijo a mi familia que iban a quedar detenidos porque habían una orden de arresto porque los acusaban de que eran pandilleros.
Carlos says they weren't going to arrest them at first, but he questioned the officer.
Solo me dijo, mira, vos andate. Vine yo y me le acerqué al señor agente, le dije yo que yo quería saber cuál era la razón de la detención. Me dijo que por pendejo y metido me iban a llevar, y como él vio que yo me fijé que en el papel no tenía nada, pues algo creíble, pues.
Entonces, él dice, tengo una orden para arrestar a estas personas. Sí. Tú dices, déjame ver, y en la lista no hay nombres.
No hay nombres.
Salvadorian newspaper El Faro examined the court documents of 690 people detained during the state of exception. They found that police sometimes reported they arrested people for reasons like they looked nervous or suspicious, that someone had anonymously accused them, or they had tattoos. But in the reports, they didn't specify if the tattoos were gang-related. None of the 690 people named in the documents were accused of murder. Carlos says most men he was detained with were not gang members.
El 4 de junio que me llevaron a la audiencia, había unos 544 en esa audiencia. Y de los 544 solo habían 32 que dijo la jueza que sí estaban realmente vinculados a pandillas y que sí andaban tatuados. Los habían hallado con armas, con drogas. Imagínense que de tanta gente, pero ni la mitad siquiera, pues para tapar algo que dicen que solo pandilleros agarrados. Para nosotros sentimos que esto del régimen iba a ser un suspiro para nosotros porque pues íbamos a poder trabajar libremente y ese dinero nos podía quedar a nosotros. Pero no, aquí de las personas que uno conoce que han andado en la situación, allá, pues. Entonces, ¿cómo va a estar seguro si ahí están infiltrados? El rato que ellos quieran armarse, vuelven a hacer lo mismo que eran antes, pues.
En muy poco tiempo, El Salvador pasó de ser la capital mundial de los homicidios, pasó de literalmente ser el país más peligroso del mundo a ser el país más seguro de América Latina.
When you take a closer look at the president's messaging, the cracks start to show. Like the announcement of a full year without homicides, Bukele's tweet now has a community note fact-checking the claim. A few weeks after the tweet, local media reported that the government's own internal documents showed homicides were 61% higher than the Bukele administration was telling the public.
A ver cuánto tiempo duran sus homeboys allá adentro. Ustedes desatan una ola de criminalidad y nosotros quitamos la comida en las cárceles.
Bukele has said he will not spend public money to make gang members feel more comfortable in prison. But Carlos says the gang members he was detained with got special treatment.
Los espaguetis, una de las dos cosas, o lleva cucarachas o te lleva excremento de rata. Asqueroso, pero es lo único que hay. Pues. Y fíjese que a los pandilleros, a los que están condenados, tienen un menú variado. Porque a ellos les llega carne, les llega medallones, les llega chorizo, les llega salchichas.
O sea, que tú veías que trataban a los pandilleros mejor.
Sí, por ejemplo, ellos andaban más cómodamente. No puedo decir, me han contado, yo lo he visto.
Gang members getting preferential treatment in prison is not new in El Salvador. The administrations before Bukele negotiated with the gangs. They offered them benefits in prison in exchange for keeping the number of homicides low on the streets. El Faro revealed that Bukele did it too. After El Faro's reporting, the Attorney General's Office of El Salvador started an investigation, and prosecutors obtained security camera footage that shows a Bukele official entering a maximum security prison. He was accompanied by masked men, some of whom prosecutors say were at-large gang members who were going to receive instructions from gang leaders in prison. Bukele denied the accusations, and then the legislature, which is controlled by Bukele's party, removed the attorney general who was investigating the government's negotiations with the gangs. But there's another investigation that's still ongoing, and that's the one by the United States government. The U.S. has also accused Bukele's administration of cutting a deal with the gangs. The Department of Justice says El Salvador's government protected MS-13 gang leaders from being extradited to the U.S. to be prosecuted. One of those leaders was Elmer Canales, known as Crook. Crook was in prison in El Salvador when the U.S. asked that he be sent to New York to face charges for terrorism. But instead, he was suddenly released, even though he still had 40 years left to serve in prison. While El Faro obtained an audio recording where a senior Bukele official admitted he helped Crook escape prison in 2021.
Y yo al viejo lo saqué de adentro, brother, en una forma de ayudarles a todos y de demostrarles mi lealtad y confianza. Pues yo mismo lo fui a traer allá y yo mismo lo fui a Guatemala.
Last November, U.S. officials found Crook in Mexico.
Es un show, pues, como le digo, uno que ha estado allá ve la pura mentira que cómo hacen.
Carlos says while he was in prison, he witnessed a visit from Osiris Luna, the Bukele official seen in this image.
En el Salco, un día llegaron a sacar todos los pandilleros. Y llegaron un grupo de personas con cámaras y todo, y ahí estaba el señor Osiris Luna. Y cuando ellos iban, o sea, fue como video lo que hicieron. Cuando ellos regresaron a la celda, llevaban paquetes de galletas que les habían dado por bajar a hacer el video.
Carlos says, ironically, the people who are not associated with the gangs are the ones suffering the most in El Salvador's prisons. He says guards brutally beat them.
A mi abuelo, en el penal también, allá le pegaron más fuerte que a nosotros porque decían, a él le chorreaba la espalda de agorrotarse. Entonces, de los muchachos que iba con nosotros, a uno le quebraron unas costillas. El muchacho llegó de arrastres a la celda. Y él pegaba gritos porque es un dolor insoportable. Por las noches él le agarraba fiebre, empezaba a delirar. Como a las 2 semanas de estar ahí, murió el muchacho en la misma celda donde yo estaba.
A human rights group from El Salvador found that more than 200 people have died while in custody since the beginning of the state of exception. They estimate that almost half of them were murdered. Carlos worries for his father and grandfather who are still detained a year and a half later.
El gobierno está usando las instituciones para matar a la gente. ¿Y los pandilleros quién mataba? A la gente humilde. Y lo mismo está haciendo el gobierno. Está matando a la gente pobre, la gente que no tiene cómo defenderse. Pues.
The lives of the people we interviewed look very different from the images of El Salvador that reach most of us. And it's almost like they're two countries. One for tourists, Bitcoin influencers, and beauty queens that looks like peace and prosperity. And another one for the Salvadorians who live in the most impoverished communities, where safety feels fragile and human rights don't apply.